Hey guys, Cobra here, and this is gonna be a video I've been wanting to do for a little bit. It's Sega versus Nintendo. Back in the '90s, this was a big deal. It's not like today where it's Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, of course. But back then, it was really Sega and Nintendo. There were other consoles, but none of them really tapped either of the sales that the Sega or Nintendo had. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to go back through some of the systems and accessories that the companies have come out with, starting from the beginning. And we'll see, and I'll sort of give you my thoughts. And at the end, I think I might just give some sort of final verdict, whatever. So let's get started. First off, Nintendo's first home console, everybody knows, was the NES. Not counting Game & Watch, none of that. We're talking about the NES. Well, I guess I'll show this one. This isn't the original because I've obviously done the paint job. But this is what it looked like. This is white, this is black, and this is a grayish color. And this is the 8-bit Nintendo NES. Sega also had an 8-bit system that not a lot of people know about. Most collectors do, of course, but that's the Sega Master System. And in this realm, I think the Nintendo looks better. But in all honesty, the Master System is more powerful. It had better graphics. It technically was a slightly better system. The only reason that it wasn't as successful in the U.S. as it was as the Nintendo, because its library. The Sega Master System had great games like Shinobi, but the NES had Mario, Mega Man, Castlevania, Contra, Battletoads. It had all that. Double Dragon. So, in terms of technology, the Master System was slightly better. It just didn't have the library. So, it couldn't compete. So, in the 8-bit wars, Nintendo wins. But around the 1989 era, Sega came out with another system called the Sega Genesis. Everybody knows what that is, but it had 16-bit graphics, twice what the NES had. But again, in the Genesis early stages, it had the same problem the Master System did. It didn't have the big titles. It had Golden Axe and things like that. But, compared to Mario and Zelda, Golden Axe and, football games, they just couldn't stack up. So the 8-bit Nintendo and the 16-bit Genesis were going at it for a little bit of time. But that's when Nintendo pulled out all the stops and released the Super Nintendo. Okay, so now let's do a Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis comparison. Because I feel like the Genesis versus the Sega, or Genesis versus the Super Nintendo, is the real war. I don't have my original Sega out right now, but I do have my CDX. It's easy. My Genesis is packed away in its box, so... let's just look at this. In terms of design, the Genesis I like more. I mean, the Super Nintendo, it's just sort of plain. There's nothing here that really grabs my attention. It's gray and it has purple buttons. That is it. Other than that, there's really nothing here. Whereas the Genesis was black, it was shiny, it was sleek, it looked good. So in terms of design, the Genesis is way better. And again, when the Genesis and Nintendo were waging war, the Nintendo had the greater library. Until Sonic came out, and then when Sonic came out, it was a bit different. Now they were really going at it, because that was Sega's saving grace, really, was Sonic. And, Sonic was their mascot, Mario was Nintendo, and they were butting heads. And another thing that really determined the console wars was Mortal Kombat. The Genesis version of Mortal Kombat, which was an arcade game, had blood, and it was a more true port than the Super Nintendo version, which didn't have blood. So that sort of gave the Sega Genesis a more edgy feel, like they're the more bad boy system than the NES, or the Super Nintendo rather. And so they've established that persona that they stuck with. That was what they did. Nintendo learned, because in Mortal Kombat 2, and I know number 3 for sure has blood, but 2 I'm pretty sure has blood. So in terms of game, edginess, I guess, is willing to push the bar. Sega's got that as well. But where Nintendo really takes Sega by the throat is in the games themselves. Sonic's good, but Sonic cannot match, when you have games like Castlevania 4 and Link to the Past. Those games are just epic adventures, whereas Sonic is just, it's just sort of side-scrolling. It's simple. Um, and I think people knew that. Nintendo ended up winning the console wars in the 16-bit era, and I can't say it's any sort of surprise when you look back at the great games that the Super Nintendo has. Um, Now that's not to sell the Sega short. No, they had some great titles. Contra Hardcores, it was a great one. Um, all the Sonic games, with the exception of a couple, are really great games. Shinobi is a franchise they kept going with. Castlevania Bloodlines. But the problem again is everybody's usually with Nintendo, like the Mega Man games. Now I've heard there is one Mega Man game released for the Sega Genesis, but it's supposed to be super rare, and so I don't really know if you want to count that. But as far as the games go, again, Nintendo has always had the edge. Um, Now let's talk about accessories. Accessories are Nintendo's sort of stronger suit and Sega's sort of weaker area. I mean, let's look at this. The Zapper with the NES. It's a great gun. It feels good. It does what it's supposed to. And Sega's Light Phaser. Now, personally, I think I like the Light Phaser a little bit better. Yeah, I think I like it a little bit better. But again, as the systems go on, Genesis accessories sort of explode, and Nintendo keeps to what they know. Some Genesis accessories are the CD, the Sega CD, the Sega 32X, the Power Base converter. Well, none of them were a big success. I mean, the Sega Genesis and the CD and the 32X were both commercial failures. Um, and I'm trying to think of anything big that Nintendo came out with. The Super Scope, sure. The Mario Paint mousepad, nothing big. What else did they have? They had the Super Game Boy, um, which allowed you to play Game Boy games on your Super Nintendo and therefore on your TV, which I think is where we're going to go next. Sega and Nintendo both had handheld consoles. Um, there were some differences, and Nintendo ended up winning. But that's not to say that the Genesis handheld was bad. This here is the Sega Game Gear. This is Nintendo or Sega's handheld. They also had the Sega Nomad, which allowed you to play Genesis games on the go, but those are a bit more rare, and they're more common. So basically, what this is, it's a Game Boy type of thing. It's a portable console that has sort of ports of console games that are on. Like here's Sonic the Hedgehog 2. This is actually, basically what this is a Sega Master System. A lot of the games that were on the Master System made their way to this. Sonic 2, notably, is one that's pretty similar. But Nintendo also had the Game Boy. I don't have an original Game Boy, but generally this is what it looked like, except it was gray and a bit bulkier. Now, the main distinction is, look at the size difference here. This is so much more portable. I can fit this in my pocket, no problem. This I cannot. And while this is in color and the original Game Boy wasn't, the Game Boy was slightly superior in a couple of ways. First off, its battery life was so much better. I have a golf game on this, and I can't even finish 18 holes on a set of batteries. It's only a few hours, and this baby drains them up. It does come with an AC adapter, which you can plug in up here and plug it into the wall and play for however long you want. But standard on batteries, the Game Boy outlasts it to such a large degree. And one more thing is, I don't really know any Game Gear games that are really good. I've never heard of a game on the Game Gear that's definitive, that you have to have to, Whereas on the Game Boy, you had Mario Land, Mario Land 2 and 3. But Sega had Sonic games, but they didn't quite live up to the Genesis model. Whereas Mario was never a fast-paced game. It was more about platforming and precision. Whereas Sonic is just loose, running all over the place. Sometimes there's precision in things, but overall, I think that the Genesis or the Game Gear couldn't quite match the Game Boy. So in the end, it really comes down to preference. They're both very close. And as a kid, we had a Sega, um, and it had some nostalgic value to me. But we also had a Super Nintendo, and I used to play Super Mario World, for hours on end. Super Mario All Stars, I'd play that for countless. Donkey Kong Country 2, we had that. I just play them forever. And the Sega was more like, oh, okay, I'll get my quick fix with a few rounds of Sonic the Hedgehog. It was never, I never really played a game on the Genesis that was a huge adventure. And I feel like that's what's missing. There are some games on there like, Shining Force or Phantasy Star. I think those are RPGs. I don't have any, but I think as far as adventure games and things like that, you've got to look towards the Super Nintendo. But if you're looking for edgy games that are fun and fast-paced and quick and you know, they're fun. I'd go towards the Sega Genesis. So what's my preference? Well, here's the bottom line. I like the Super Nintendo and I like the Sega Genesis. And as I've started collecting, I've started to respect the Sega Genesis even more as I've seen the games that it has. But I think it's very hard, extremely hard to differ away from the Nintendo when it has games like Contra 3 and Super Mario RPG and Super Metroid and things like that. It's just so hard to get away. So I'm going to give my tip of the cap to Nintendo, Super Nintendo. Um, I love the Genesis. I think it's fantastic. It's probably one of my favorite systems. But the Super Nintendo is just slightly better. Again, though, it's all preference. It depends on what you want. I know Segas are a lot more common now. You can find them a lot easier than you can a Super Nintendo, and I think that might speak to the Super Nintendo's greatness. Not a lot of people want to get rid of them. They're really good. Whereas Sega's people are like, okay, I've had enough with these John Madden sports games, you know, but I haven't had enough of the Super Mario World. So I think that's where today it is. That's why you see more. Um, so in the end, again, like I said before, I'm gonna give my tip of the cap to Nintendo. I think they stuck to their guns and they did what was best. Whereas Sega differed off with the CD and the 32X, trying to improve on things. Whereas they should have done what Nintendo did and just stuck to what they did best, and that was making some great games. So this is Cobra, and this has been my Super Nintendo versus, or this has been my Nintendo versus Sega video.